Morning. Welcome. I'm Eddie Torres, President and CEO of Grantmakers in the Arts. Welcome to the third day of our annual conference, Plurality, Power, and Belonging. We are so glad to be spending this time with you all. Um, for those who've joined us over the past few days, I hope that you have been as inspired as I've been. Um, we have gotten together for keynotes, for breakout sessions, for workshops, for roundtables. And we're also being really explicit in our call to action, the call to increase investment in artists and organizations in Puerto Rico, but as well to increase engagement and advocacy for fair public policies for Puerto Rico. We are really excited to be able to feature Beatriz Santiago Munoz in today's keynote. And I just want to start with a couple of pieces of housekeeping. So the presentation is going to be largely in English, but I just want to make sure that everybody is aware that we have interpretation available, and whether it's going to be in English or Spanish, you do need to choose a language in the interpretation button below, just because we'll periodically go back and forth, and if we do, your audio is going to cut out when we do. So go down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, and there is a button that says interpretation. Click on that button and choose your preferred channel. Now, we had an issue yesterday where people were hearing very softly the other language being spoken in the background. The way to make sure that you're not dealing with that is to make sure that when you get onto your Zoom, you're doing so through Attendify. Now, I'm going to do all that in Spanish now. Todas las participantes pueden sentirse en la libertad de hablar en su idioma de preferencia durante las actividades de esta sección. Ofrecemos el servicio de interpretación simultánea en inglés y español durante nuestras reuniones, talleres, presentaciones, y así cada participante puede comunicarse en el idioma con el que se sienta más cómodo. Presione el botón en la parte inferior de Zoom que dice interpretación. Debes elegir una idioma. We all need to choose a language. Okay, so we're also providing closed captions. So down at the bottom, different Zooms say different things. Mine says more at the far right. You click on that, you click on live transcript. We're also putting a hyperlink into the chat that hyperlinks you to a Spanish language transcript. Ponemos un hyperlink en el chat para transcripción en español. So I wanted to again say thank you to all of you who are here. I want to say thank you to Beatriz Santiago Munoz, and I am really excited to be able to hand it off to Grantmakers in the Arts Vice President, Nadia Lokda.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm so glad to be here with you all today. This conference has been so incredible, and I can't be more honored than to be here today to introduce Beatriz Santiago Munoz, who we've been working with for some time now to prepare for this keynote. Beatriz is an artist whose expanded moving image work is entangled with Walian theater, expanded cinema, and feminist practices. She tends to work with non-actors and incorporates improvisation into her process. Her recent work is on the sensorial unconscious of anti-colonial movements, with everyday poetic thought and feminist experiments with language and narrative. Recent solo exhibitions include Oriana in Pibo, Sao Paulo, the 34th Sao Paulo Biennial, the Momenta Biennale in Montreal, and Gosalia in Der Tank, Basel. Her work is part of public and private collections, such as the Museum of Modern Art, Caddis and Guggenheim, among others. She has received a Creative Capital Grant, a USA Fellowship, an Herb Alpert Award for the Arts, and the 2021 Artes Mundi Prize, shared among all 7 nominees. I am so thrilled that I can be able to pass this along to Beatriz. Please take it away.
Hi. Thank you so much for the invitation, Grantmakers in the Arts, and thank you, Eddie and Nadia, for the introduction. And thank you all on the other side of this strange system. I know we are still in pandemic crisis world in many parts of the world and parts of the United States right now. And so I'm conscious of the weirdness that these formats continue to be. And so thank you for the attention that you can give this right now. So the way that this is going to go for most of my talk is that you should actually see two screens. On one, you're going to see a screen of clips of my work. I'm not going to be speaking in a synchronized way to them. I just want you to get a sense of what the work feels like and looks like. So at some point, those clips are going to kick in. But as I was thinking about how to start giving you some context for my work, I thought about showing you a couple of clips that I haven't screened in a really long time. And it's work I made almost 20 years ago when I first, but I think that they'll explain something about sort of a through line that goes through all of the work. I grew up here in Puerto Rico and I went off to college in the United States. And when I graduated from the MFA at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, I returned home. But when I returned, I found that there was a dissonance between what I had learned in terms of context, history of art, and also methods and forms of paying attention. I wanted to learn how to make work here. And at that moment, I realized that what I needed to do was to set in motion a kind of ground level process of paying attention. And I was interested in the everyday performance of people's lives. I had, no money, but I had a camera. So I started making this really off the cuff work where I would approach people on the street or people in places that I would go to that I was interested in, and I would ask them to perform some local histories, some histories that they knew personally about. And so I'm going to show you some clips from that work so you get a sense of what that was. And for that, I'm going to share my screen. And so this first clip that you are going to see, and you're not going to hear it. This is just, okay. So I hope that you guys can see this. So I walked into a place that what is now the art school in Puerto Rico, but in that moment it was being rehabilitated, and I offered, that place used to be a military hospital. So I offered a white sheet to the workers, and I asked them if they would perform stories that they imagined to be related to the life of the hospital. And this is what they made. This is what they did in the 20 minutes that we were there playing together. So they performed, what you're watching is they performed one of the workers having an accident, and then they transformed through that process, the place, into a hospital. Throughout the scene, they care for him in different ways, and then he dies. So that's one of the. I called this work Archivo because it's actually a collection of many different situations. And in this case, I asked the first generation of people that grew up in the town of Villa Sin Miedo, which was a rescate de tierras, I'm not sure, a land rescue, famous land rescue in Puerto Rico. This is the first generation of kids that grew up in that community, performing the stories about that they had heard from their parents and other family members. It's all done in a very improvised, playful way, and so for me, this process allowed me to create a film that was neither something that I was completely structuring beforehand, nor something that was, let's say, observation or documentary, but something in between, a kind of ethnography of what can be imagined together. I had a hunch. I'm going to show you another clip. I had a hunch that the kinds of things that are possible to think about with one's bodies is very different than what is possible to say. So this is another clip that I made after, another video that I made after Archivo. It's all shot in a factory. And I spent about 2 months visiting the factory and paying attention to everything that happened in the, everything that happens in the factory that does not go towards the economic logic of the factory, but that has to do with people's imaginations. So in this scene, I asked the managers to give the speech that they would give if the factory were to close, which then also allowed the workers to respond to that possible situation, which they did by asking if it was possible to create a cooperative, or for the workers to participate somehow in what was happening in this imagined scene. So this for me was a really important moment. In Nadia's bio that she just read, she refers to Boalian techniques or Boalian theater, and really these techniques of a kind of committed improvisation by the participants is something that has taught me a lot. Now you can see here that there is a moment in which the workers then have the opportunity, because we are performing this, have the opportunity to ask certain questions about economic justice, perhaps, that would not be possible to ask in another situation. There are other scenes which are very playful, in which there's other things that happen, but for me, this one was the one that taught me the most, that taught me what was possible. You can see from their demeanor, the managers are incredible actors too. They were giving a really heartfelt speech. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing. I hope that was visible. And Christine, who's back there in tech, you can start playing the other video right now. So then what you're seeing on the other screen should be just a collection of clips from my work that will, at some point have some coincidences with what I'm talking about. But really, I want you to have a kind of sensorial, parallel sensorial track to what I'm saying. So one thing that I wanted to say about those first works that I made 20 years ago, you can tell that they're really quickly made, very improvised. It's just me with the camera. There's nobody else there. And that creates a really interesting relationship with people. I like to say that it's not, yes, I make moving image works, I make film video, but I work with a camera, in the sense that a camera is a physical thing that can create social realities. It makes certain things possible. It's like walking around with an eye, but it's an external eye. So you don't just see, but we are all together. We see seeing. So we are really conscious when you have a camera in the room of not just the way that the people that are involved at that moment see, but the levels of attention that sort of radiate outwards as well. So the camera itself can produce situations. It is a social object that allows for certain kind of relationships to exist that otherwise couldn't. And so one story that something that stuck with me from that time that I was doing those works is that at the very beginning, I thought, this is so strange. What I'm asking people to do is so weird. So I would go up to people and I'd say, I'm making this strange documentary, and I'd like you to think about the kinds of things that happened in this place and how you remember it. And people would just start talking. Like, I did these series that were reenactments of the murder of Toño Bicicleta, who was himself a notorious assassin. And people would just start talking and telling me the same things, like with language, a kind of narrative that I knew was already, had already been circulating, and it was actually not what I wanted. And at some point, out of frustration, I asked in the most, transparent, way I could. I said, I am an artist, and I'm trying to get at something that I think is in your body. And so what I'm asking you to do is to get up on your feet and perform this. And they were like, okay, yeah, let's do it, let's play. And so it was really a moment of, like, mind blowing, when I realized that the let's say conventional forms, that I was referring to, that I thought perhaps would be more familiar to people, I would make people feel more comfortable, were boring and just led them to the same places as always. Whereas the proposal to say, I am an artist and I want you to make art with me, actually opened up a lot of possibilities. So, of course, since that time, that is my approach to working with others. I work mostly with non-actors, with people whose lives I'm interested in. And I try to be really clear about the kind of work that I'm making. And the fact, for example, that even when I'm collaborating with people whose lives are intensely political or who might be themselves activists, that the kind of work that I am making is not instrumental, that it cannot be instrumentalized towards a political end. So I know that art can do a lot of other things other than the kind of sensorial, thinking that it does. I know that art has other kinds of consequences in terms of health and education and even economies. But for me, the most important thing is what art does by itself. And so it's very important for me when I am collaborating with others that what we are both paying attention is those possibilities of expansion of thinking that can happen between us. So, okay, that's my general sort of like where the origin of a lot of this work comes from. You'll see that, throughout all the work that I'm describing, there's always a kind of thinking with others and a kind of thinking with the place that that forces me to think about the camera in a different way as well. So one of the first place that I want to start is actually happens to coincide with what's on the screen right now, is a work that I made in 2011. It's called La Cueva Negra. And at the moment, I was really interested in a kind of thinking about a place that collapsed historical layers. I had the experience of seeing images of Puerto Rico that either presented images of the place as a kind of romanticized agricultural past, which I don't know how that can happen, but it does still, or the vision of military domination, images produced more or less through the military, or images produced through the service industry of Puerto Rico as a kind of paradise. In all of these, there is a separation of historical and political processes and the idea of nature. But that's not my experience of living in this place. And I don't think that's really anybody's experience. We live in a place that has been impacted by military occupation, as you know, by bombing in Vieques, by the after effects that can have. We are still living through after effects of processes that began hundreds of years ago with slavery and continuing racialization. So my thinking was that actually the way that we experience this place is that we experience all of these events happening at the same time. I was at the time kind of obsessed with walking through the proposed path of a gas pipeline that in fact was never built, which is a good thing. And through walking through this path, because I wanted to know what were the landscapes that were going to be destroyed, I arrived at this place underneath a highway underpass that had been built in 1992. It is called Paso del Indio. And I learned while I was there talking to the neighbors that live around the place that when this highway had been built in 1992, because of the place's history, because it was called Paso del Indio, many archaeologists were paying attention to what was going to be found. And so the moment that these giant diggers that were there to build the pilotes that the highway was going to be built, the moment that the giant diggers put their hands inside the earth and brought out whole skeletons, remains of indigenous people, archaeologists were there to say, now you have to stop the construction, and there has to be a process of investigation of the site. And what happened then was that the people that lived in the hills surrounding it for the next 5 years became the workers who then disinterred these remains with their hands, with brushes. And after 5 years of doing this work, the government decided that they didn't want to continue the investigation and changed the law, in fact, in order to be able to build a highway, to continue building the highway. The highway was built, the place was covered with brea, what you cover roads with. And then what you're looking at here is the secondary forest that has grown in the 20 or so years when I was shooting this in 2011, between the highway and those disinterments and now. So these kids grew up in this forest, playing in this forest, and finding and hearing about these stories and finding the objects, now not the remains of people who were interred there before, but finding the remains of the archaeological digs. So if you can just imagine that for a second, highway, archaeological dig, moment of disinterment, the past that we imagined before that, all of that together is being perceived by them at the same time. So the work that I made with them is a kind of projection of all these histories being collapsed in the place, of being perceived at the same time. And the way that I began working with them was that I visited I was visiting this forest underneath the highway every weekend with my camera and talking to people. People would ask me what I was doing, and I would, say, just like I said before, I would say it in, I'm interested in what has happened here before. I'm interested in what looking with my camera can show me. I've read stories about of indigenous mythologies that I think are in some ways overlaid onto this landscape, and I'm interested in what this might mean. And I had interesting conversations with people where they would interact with this that I was explaining to them that I was interested in. And at some point, these two adolescents who you saw in the previous clip saw me shooting there, this woman with a camera underneath a highway in the forest, and said, "What are you doing?" And I explained to them what I was doing and what I was interested in. And they said, "Well, we're looking for a horse, which we have lost." And I said, "Well, if I see a horse, I'll let you know. And it'd be interesting to shoot an image of a horse as well. So if you want to, if you find it, I'd love to film the horse here." And so when they came back, they had found the horse. They were riding, both of them together, the horse. And they said, "Well, here we are. You can shoot the horse now." And they posed. And I said, "Okay, well, you want to be in the film?" And they said, "Yes. Well, we know something about this place." And so from that moment on, every time I arrived on a Saturday or Sunday to shoot underneath the underpass, I would call up to them and they would come down, and I would propose a structure and we would improvise together. And the result of that is the work, La Cueva Negra. So I wanted to describe that work to you as well, because then things begin to have a bit more structure. No, I'm not just like walking, up to people in the street and, inventing things with them at the moment. But there's something, it's more like a kind of structured improvisation is what is happening. So I'll tell you about another work that I think you might find interesting. So and this is, well, now the image has changed, but before you were watching a bit of a clip from a film called Pharmacopoeia. Pharmacopoeia is a collection of plants, usually referred to as a collection of medicinal plants. And I made two films with the man that appears in Pharmacopoeia. I made Pharmacopoeia, and I came back to do another film with him called Matrulla. And I guess I want to describe this film to you because it shows, there's a difference between what you imagine you're going to make and then what kind of work you can make when you're open to, things that you don't know. So the film Pharmacopoeia, I had this interest in plants that one could say, certain species of plants that one could say the historical or political life of Puerto Rico has been kind of co-produced with these plants. So you could say that about tobacco, or you could say that about sugar, which are the ones that we know had a huge presence and transformed our landscape and are, associated to the political labor systems, oppressive systems in the island. But you could also talk about the species that we know are not here. So, for example, Ipomane manchinella, which is Manzanilla de la Muerte, a really super poisonous tree that used to cover the entire coast of Puerto Rico, and that the Spanish colonizers very specifically decided to eradicate because it was something that could be used against them. So there's very, very few of these specimens left of Manzanilla de la Muerte. There's a few here and there. And I was interested in taking this collection of plants, both the plants like tobacco and the plants like Manzanilla de la Muerte, and looking at them and getting to know them, making a film about them, because they are actors in our history. And in the process of finding those plants, there were some that I had a really hard time finding. And farmers that I was talking to kept saying, well, the only person that I can imagine that you might be able to get that plant from is Pablo Diaz Cuadrado. And he lives in Orocovis, and you have to find him by going to the market on this day, da, 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 da. So I did. I found Pablo Diaz Cuadrado. He lives in a place in Orocovis, which is a mountain town in the center of the island. And it was so hard to find his house, even with the kilometer number, because I kept going backwards and forwards and looking at the mountain, and I couldn't see it because his house and his entire system of farming is so well adapted to the mountain. The wall of his house is the rocks of the mountain. The house is leaning on it. So when I found the plants, but I realized that here was this person who had been paying for the past 40 years a kind of attention to the place that I didn't have access to, that I couldn't just, come out of myself and suddenly see the world in this way, but that I had to see it through him. So I returned to Orocovis to make a film that is about him, and about the forms of, about the practices that he engages in. And you'll see a little clip of that coming up soon. He is a kind of rearguard visionary, in the sense that he can see things coming from a long space away, a long time away, and because of that, he is gathering the materials that the world is not paying attention to. So he uses, satellite dishes to catch the water, or he uses, like 5-gallon buckets to grow mango seeds, or he has, 6 different varieties of malanga, some of which haven't been farmed in a really long time, but he knows exactly why there's these 2 species that these 2 kinds that he needs to farm, and he does this. He does this by staying behind, So it proposes, like his daily practice proposes a way of thinking about the world that is maybe the opposite of innovation, because you're not thinking about getting ahead of things, but rather you're staying behind to take care of everything that is being abandoned. And so I made a film because his daily practice and his life proposes a philosophy. It contains a kind of thinking that I think is a really important philosophical contribution on his part. I just realized that there's been a couple of clips in which you may have seen or recognized Mapenzi Nono, who is half of the Las Nietas de Nono group that presented to you yesterday. And here is Pablo Diaz Cuadrado now. So, and then a little bit, actually, in maybe 10 minutes, you will see some images of a new film in which Mulo Wayi performs as well. So this I think that you will maybe see a kind of continuity between this work, Pharmacopeia and Matrulla, and then another series of works that I made between 2014 and 2016, all in what can be more or less described as post-military land or land that has been occupied by a military operation. So these are works that I have made in Vieques and actually primarily in Roosevelt Roads, which is the part of the Navy base that Vieques was part of, but actually the larger section, which is on the island of Puerto Rico on the eastern coast in Ceiba, and whose presence, when that part of the base was built in the 1940s, there were people living there who had been given land as part of a land reform. There are people that for the first time had farm that had land that they could farm, and these were the people that were displaced when the Roosevelt Roads Navy base was built. And that this is another example of a kind of compressing of historical moments that I was interested in terms of thinking about land. Because when you are in the Roosevelt Roads Navy base, you experience many different, I would say many different philosophies or ideologies all at the same time that express themselves through materials and express themselves sensorially. So for example, you might notice at first, since the base has been closed since 2002, you might notice at first, sorry, I shouldn't pay attention to the chat, right? I'm just gonna close it. So you might notice at first being at the base that the first thing you feel is a ruin of the military structures, right? Because we are so trained to understand that kind of layout, right? So we see the dock that is 1.5 miles long, and we see the old movie theater, and we see the places where R&D of drones used to happen, and we see the houses where soldiers used to live, and we see the house where the commanders, I don't really know anything about military structure, but the people that have the best view, which actually in that base was the view of Vieques being bombed. That was the best view, and that was where the bar was. So the first thing that you might experience, because we know these structures so well, because we're trained to recognize them, is these ruined military structures, which are colossal, right? They feel they're just gigantic and crumbling around you. But there are many other things happening that are harder to see, and they're harder to see because we have those military structures really like close to the eyes. And some of that, for example, is I learned, through talking to people involved in forestry, that in the tropics, a secondary forest takes roughly about 60 years to be indistinguishable from a primary forest in terms of density. You may have kind of understood that from that first video, La Cueva Negra, that I showed, in which, the forest that is just 20 years old, that is underneath the highway, looks like it has been there forever. So what you see in a base that has been closed for 20 years is a place that is a third of the way towards being indistinguishable from a forest. But then that itself is not specific enough, perhaps. You also see that there is a certain kind of species that is growing in the place where there had been a toxic spill. So you can see the landscape responding and adapting to what has happened there over the past 60 years. You see also a kind of Frankenstein ecology of iguanas taking over, stray dogs chasing the iguanas that are now eating other kinds of amphibians. Also certain sea animals are returning to the bays that before only had submarines, like now manatees, or when I jumped from one of the docks, somebody warned me that there could be sharks there as well. And the other thing that, so these are all the things that I started seeing, but that when I looked through my camera, the camera only made visible the kind of, or made most visible the kind of strong diagonals that emphasized that kind of colossal, monumental structure of the military, which didn't allow me to get out of seeing it as ruin, which I think is a problem, right? Like and I want to talk about this because so the process of arriving at a way to create an image that didn't just reproduce that colossal structure, that didn't just reproduce military as ruin, was a process of experimentation. What I mean is it wasn't inside of me. I couldn't, and I guess I'm saying this because it has something to do with arts funding. There's no way that I could have written a proposal that said what I was going to do because I didn't know how to do it. I had to spend time there and I had to experiment. And finally, I had to see the ways in which shore fishermen were breaking into through the fence that blocked off the base. Were breaking through the fence and going to that dock and parking their cars there and standing in the dock and with just a bucket and a line fishing and paying attention to that action, understanding then that there are actions, that there are ways of being in the world that can return the scale to the place. So, and this is, it may be something that is hard to understand, how seeing in a different way can also have political consequences. But for example, the only thing that our government can imagine happening in Ceiba right now as they redevelop is something that makes use of this colossal scale. Well, we have to have yachts. We have to have, something that uses this. It must be like Disney World, there must be something that uses this colossal scale. But in fact, what needs to happen is that we need to see again that there are other scales, not just human scales, but other level of species, that at every moment, if you pay attention with a recorder and you raise the volume and the gain, you will see, you will hear, you will listen to thousands of events that are not visible at the scale of military occupation, but that are happening and that in fact can come to completely overtake and transform these 60 years of occupation. So it's an example that I wanted to use because the resulting work is one that I made with a set of mirrors. So after seeing these people, and thinking about the scale of the fishing, I thought, well, I have to change the scale. I have to change what the camera does. In some ways, I have to break its rational reproduction of the image. And I did that by making these mirrored objects that in a very simple way fold the landscape, that do not allow me to see into infinity, that treat the landscape as something that can be held. And maybe when you see the clip, which is coming up, without all this context, it would be hard to understand how this abstract image, or what this abstract image has to do with how we can imagine a future for this place that is not a constant reproduction of those kinds of scales, but that's where the work came from. And I think that in some ways, I am really conscious of the way that the archive of images of this place, of Puerto Rico, of the Caribbean, of land that has been occupied and I'm really conscious of the images, of how the images that are produced organize what we think is possible in this place, organize what we think is possible to imagine. So I want to. So here's in this clip is an image that is one of the images in the film, which is a 16mm film shot through these mirrored objects in the Roosevelt Roads Navy base. At the very end of the film, but not in the clip that you see here, you see the men fishing in the shore. So there is a reference, to the ways in which these different ways of seeing come from these different ways of one's body inhabiting a place, of living in a place. All right, so out of that, I mean, this is just one of the works that I made. I think my approach to it was like, how about like this? How about if I see like this? Do I see differently? If I see like this, if I do, just proposing all these different ways of looking. And one of them, I don't know if I have a clip of that here, is with a man called Pedro Ortiz, who was somebody whose family was displaced from Ceiba when the base was built, and also somebody who was very involved with activism of neighbors going into the place. It was really a beautiful moment where I connected with them first, with this group of activists, neighbors, people that grew up in Ceiba that were breaking into the base. I connected with them first, and I said, look, I want to make a series of works there. I don't know exactly what they are. I'm just wondering what you think. I was kind of asking permission, like, what do you think? Can I go in with you? What do you think? How do you think I can do this? And do you think there's somebody that I need to ask permission? And he said that is absolutely the point. You need to ask no one for permission. Bring your scissors, just cut the hole through the fence. And of course, what he was asking me to do was also to put my body in a place where it matters, because he knew that the way to transform how the government was thinking about what could happen in this space was actually to put your body in the place, to use it, to go inside and use it. And that was, this group of people, like their battle with the neighbors was you need to take risks and actually be inside the base. So basically what they convinced me was that even though I didn't know what to do, I didn't know what my approach was going to be, that the most important thing that I could do was to be there, to stand on the dock and be there with them. So one of the clips that you're seeing here is from the film that I made in the movie theater, which was the movie theater that was used for soldiers and played, Hollywood movies and that kind of thing. And I decided, so another way of thinking, another approach or another experiment was to go into the movie theater and make the film that the movie theater made by itself. Just look at the light that was coming in through the forest and shown onto the seeds. Look at the animals that were growing there. There were bats, and it was all wet, and there were beehives above the what do you call that? El plafond, the ceiling tiles. It was a whole ecological system. So I think I wanna make I want to tie this work somehow to this other series of works that one of whom you're seeing right now, because they're somewhat related, but it's hard to see how. So I've been interested for a long time in the sensorial unconscious of the anti-colonial movement. So by that I would say there's ways of talking about political autonomy, and there's ways of talking about political action through language. But I'm interested in the things that can't quite be described in language, or I know that the kind of political action that comes through a group of women that meet together in a kitchen with two babies on one's lap is different than the kind of politics that happens in the stump speeches. So I'm interested in those ways in which we can have some kind of sensorial accounting of an anti-colonial movement. And this is a film that I made with Elisam Escobar, who spent 19 and a half years in prison for seditious conspiracy. But it is a film that I made with him about the census. And in this part, he was humming his favorite song. So I met Elisam a really long time ago when he was still in prison, and I had a professor at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago who was making a documentary about the construction of the idea of terrorism. And he needed to go interview Elisam in prison in El Reno, and I was his Puerto Rican student who could speak in Spanish to Elisam and avoid the ears of, or the understanding of, the warden that would be sitting in that room. I met him for the first time then when I went to interview him, and then I met him again when he was released from prison, and he became my colleague at the Escuela de Artes Plásticas, and we became friends. And so it wasn't until 20 years later that I made a film with him. And so here the clips tell me that we're getting to the end. And so maybe I'll describe a bit of what the work that I've been working on for the past 2 years that you saw a little bit of is called Oriana. And Oriana is a very, very loose adaptation of Monique Wittig's 1969 novel, Les Guerrières. It is an experimental novel. You'll see the relationship here and why I love it so much. I read it when I was 19, and it is all it narrates a war against patriarchy, but there are no descriptions of battle scenes. There are no protagonists. It's just hundreds and hundreds of women described through their proper names. Women, the category woman stands for anybody who wants to investigate what it means to identify with the sign woman. She Wittig was a really amazing experimental writer. So the book is entirely composed of sensorial descriptions. The women say, the women eat, the weapons glisten in the sun. And I wanted to overlay this narrative of a group of women, a large group of women rebelling onto the people, the women who I know here who are doing that work, and onto the places that are familiar to me. And through this kind of translation, if you can think of it as a translation, not just in terms of language, but from text to the visual, through this translation, see what one can say about the other. So I think that we are reaching the end here. And I think to close, I just wanted to, there's really just one thing I want to say to funders of arts, and it is give money to artists. Give money to artists to think, to experiment, and it will be worthwhile. It's very hard I mean, a lot of artists are people like me who were the people that were bad at writing and bad at math. And so the fact that we have to write proposals now and make budgets is particularly troubling. I understand why it needs to happen, but also I just want to say that the awards that I have been so lucky to receive, like the Herb Alpert Award and the United States Artist Fellowship, have been absolutely life-changing, because the amount of money and the fact that it was unrestricted allowed me to really think and do things that I couldn't do before. So thank you so much for listening to me for 45 minutes.
Beatriz, thank you for joining us. That was amazing. That was so good. I hope you don't mind. I would like to just speak with you for a moment. You throughout your closing point about making sure that grant makers support artists in a manner that allows them the freedom to do their work. You made that point so brilliantly throughout this entire presentation by showing the work itself and also speaking to the ways that artists are able to create new ways of seeing. The way you talked about that Frankenstein ecology of the abandoned military site, or even the turn of phrase you used was so good, the film the movie theater made by itself. So first of all, just the way you could not possibly have anticipated that in advance to put that into a proposal. But even when you very early on made the point that your work is not meant to be a political instrument, but then later on nuanced it to add that new ways of seeing open new possibilities, and those include political possibilities. It was so smart. I really so appreciated it, and it was moving. It was beautiful. It was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, and thank you for listening. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question that came in the Q&A. So somebody asked what the non-actors gain from participating in the art making, and also if they understand the reach that your art has. Like, in other words, they have a sense of how it's being shown and things like that, because obviously we're all being really moved and impressed. And do they have a sense that this is subsequently what's happening?
I think that, I mean, that's one thing that I'm really conscious of, and I, just like I was trying to explain in the beginning, I think that you actually find that people are more open the more you say, and the more you even explain how much you don't know, you know? I have to say, though, that it really is something very different to have that conversation with somebody like Elie Sam or Jan Sussler, who I made a film with, or with a physicist that I made a film, or, people involved with the art world or with politics, or then with a couple of adolescents, So, like, the conversation is really different, and there's to a certain extent, I know more about the context than they can possibly imagine. So, I mean, I have this picture that I sometimes show of, like, I would bring the film in the middle of cutting to the two kids that appear in, and so they would make interventions into what I was making. So, for example, when they saw their own image on the horse, they're like, well, we need to bring a motorcycle into this, because the image that it created was to them too rural, And so that we then created a narrative twist in the story in which the horse becomes a motorcycle. So there's but this was very different actually than what Elie Sam did, which Elie Sam, being an artist himself, said, you are the artist, you make all the decisions, you tell me what I need to do, and I respect that. So, and that was really, it was really interesting and very different than other projects. So so I would say that there's always like a level of power that is on my side, and that I try to open that out as much as possible and to give as much information as possible, but that there's always that asymmetry in the work.
Well, I mean, that's a perfect point, especially for a room full of grant makers, because the first step in that process is even recognizing that there is power.
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting too, the story of the young folks who wanted to make sure the image was not too rural, and that so paralleled your preamble to that story about how you were so tired of seeing images of a romanticized agricultural past, or from the service industry or from the military occupation, and it seems like they actually expressed a very similar desire.
Right. I mean, they understand that that their relationship to the place is complex, and they understood, really quickly when that was flattened into a kind of beautiful image of the two of them on a horse. Yeah. I also want to say that there's another, like that film, in a way you watch it now, and it's really about the relationship between the two of them. They have such an incredible, tender relationship. And it's not something that I put there. It's something that, it is the thing that is most present about the film now that you see it, and it's not something that I made. So the work can kind of surprise you as well. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I am so grateful that you were here with us today, and I'm so glad that we got to share your voice and we got to share those amazing images. So, bien interesante. Gracias.
Thank you for having me.
I want to take a few minutes just to say thank you to some of our other colleagues. I want to say thank you to our sponsors, the Serdna Foundation, Bloomberg Philanthropies, Lamboyan Arts Fund, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Joyce Foundation, Miranda Family Fund, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and the Wallace Foundation. I want to thank Looking Glass Creative, the team from LingoVox, our volunteers, and I want to say thank you to the entire team at Grant Makers in the Arts, Nadia Lokta, Sherilyn Seeley, Steve Klein, Carmen Graciela Diaz, Sylvia Jung, Champ Connect, George Marfo II, and Zoe Williams. We are starting our breakout sessions at 2:15 Atlantic Standard Time. Looking forward to seeing you the rest of the day today. Thank you.